Install the best version of you.
So as we say in France, it's time for the apéro. It's past 8 p.m., so you're allowed to drink. I'm still gonna put that on the Coca-Cola sign here. This is Romanian beer, by the way. So just like fuck you, Coca-Cola. Anyways, most of you are here for Jeff, and you're like, oh, this guy's gonna talk about training. It's gonna be boring, and it might be for you guys. But for the others who've been staying there for all of those, presentations, well done, because you are really pretty, fucking warriors. So I'm Chris. I'm the co-founder of a company called Somewhere Else. We're based in London, and we create immersive learning solutions. So in other words, we are in the business of helping people becoming the best versions of themselves as fast as possible, and importantly, without hurting anyone else in the process. So let's start with a little game, which I call the Robert De Niro career picker. So here it goes. Let's imagine that you have to choose a new career today that you're going to start tomorrow for the rest of your life. Would you choose to become a priest? Would you choose to become a taxi driver? Or would you choose to become a politician? So who would go for priest? Raise your hand. Okay, so it's a weird nation you have, guys. About like 15% of you are priests. Who would become a taxi driver? Okay, so that's about 70%. Who would become a politician? Okay, I've heard he's not too good here, so I understand that. Here's the result. Everyone who chose to be a taxi driver, you made a huge mistake. And I'm going to tell you why. Those are numbers that are attributed to the percentage of chances of those jobs being replaced by machines in the next 20 years. So if you're a taxi driver, you're fucked. If you're a priest, you're going to do all right, because it's not easy to automate a priest, right? On the right, you have racist politicians. That was not an actual category in the study, but given the current context, I don't think they're going anywhere. So what I'm talking about here is automation. It's coming for you. It's eating away at both hard skills jobs and knowledge jobs. In the UK only, it's 15 million jobs in the next 20 years that are going to be replaced. From 2016 to 2020, 35% of the top skills needed in business have changed. So it's coming fast. And as individuals or organizations, if you don't reskill or upskill, you're going to become redundant. And so a lot of organizations have started to shift the focus away from knowledge. Like, knowledge dies fast. If you become coding on a new language today, in 4 years, it's useless, right? Organizations have started to shift the focus towards teaching people to act and think on their own. Today, your mindset is more important than your skill set. You can call that, behavior, attitude, but in any ways, the value of soft skills as a professional currency is soaring. So, since I'm pressed, I'm going to skip a few slides. What makes immersive learning so important in the context where you have to adapt in permanence? So that guy, for real, is my real grandfather. He's very handsome. He's still alive, and he used to be a test pilot for the French Air Force and the US Air Force. And back in 1964, he was asked to test the maximum altitude of a plane. So he drove the plane up to 60,000 feet, and then at 60,000 feet, the engine turned itself off. His instruction was to not turn the engine back on until 20,000 feet. So for about a minute and a half, he was hurtling down towards Earth, trapped in 10 tons of metal, not knowing whether the engine was going to work again. So spoiler alert, I'm here today, so he didn't die, right? He's all good. But if you think about it, it's a pretty dangerous way of training people. And so today, you have flight simulators. Because if you crash a plane, you die, other people die, it costs a lot of money. Flight simulators cost upwards of £1 million. Now, the Oculus Quest that everyone has been talking about today costs £400. So that's 2,000 times less expensive. So what we're talking about today is not the technology. VR doesn't matter. It's the value proposition. And that value proposition has existed for years, but now it's accessible to a lot more people. So more precisely, here's the rule of VR. If you're going to do VR, it has to be too dangerous, too rare, too costly, or too impossible to do in real life. Okay, so too dangerous, we just saw it. If you crash a plane, it's not good. In VR, it's okay to die. Has anyone of you heard about a condition called situs inversus? Or is anyone victim of that condition? Situs inversus is when your organs, internal, are on the other way around, right? That's one person in a thousand. If you go for a surgical operation, your surgeon is going to go completely crazy, and you're likely to die as well. Because when you train as a surgeon, you work on corpses, right? So try to find a fresh corpse that has that condition. In VR, inverting the organs is just one click. The cost argument is very obvious. If you're training people to, let's say, put out fires on an oil rig, you have to fly them with a helicopter and you have to put fire to an oil rig. In VR, you press the restart button and here you go. And finally, impossible. If you think about it, in VR, everyone says it's a time travel machine. You can go, to World War I if you want to. You can go to the moon, but it's more than that. In VR, you can be anyone. You can step inside the body of someone who is a different gender, a different age, a different race. And if you need a time machine to travel through time, VR is a machine to travel through human experiences. And that's the second ROI of the title. That's what we call the return on impossible. And for companies, that means that you have to think, when you do immersive learning, about things that you cannot do in real life. And that's something that's very hard for a lot of people. I think it was Irv, or maybe someone before, who had the Confucius saying, for those who are here. But basically, the idea, as you know, is the more active you are in a learning scenario, the more you remember. So you remember 10% of what you read, 90% of what you do. Now, VR sits somewhere very close to doing. There was this study last year by the University of Warwick where they compared learning the exact same thing from either text or video or VR. And VR showed better memorability, better understanding, better reported positive emotions, and better reported engagement. So that's power number 2, improved learning performance. Now let's go to the third power, behavioral change. Has any one of you ever played with those apps where, you send your photo and it gives you a photo back of yourself looking very old? And it's very depressing. So what they've done at Stanford University is they grabbed about 200 students and they created a 3D avatar for each of the students that looked like them. Group A, the 3D avatar looked exactly like them, about 20-year-olds. Group B, the avatar looked like them, but 70-year-olds. And then they put everyone in VR, were in front of a mirror, and they asked them to sing, to dance, to play the bongos, and so on. And the people who were in the old body, well, they sang a bit shit, they were dancing weird, but you could argue that it's like the same at Halloween. If you dressed as a banana or as Donald Trump, you're not going to act the same way. Hopefully you don't dress as Donald Trump. So there was a questionnaire with a researcher after the experience, and all the questions were bullshit apart from the last one, which was, well, the social science department wants to know how you're going to spend the money we just gave you for that experience. Are you going to go on holiday? Are you going to party? Are you going to buy a present for a friend? Or are you going to save money for later? Now, the people who had been in the old body for just a few minutes, they saved on average 3 times more money. So we changed the single most important economic behavior completely subconsciously. There was no mention of money whatsoever in the experience. Another example of that is the Superman experiment. So in the Superman experiment, you have 2 groups of people, and they are told that they have to fly over a city, like in a video game, VR video game, to find a kid that is stranded with diabetes and save the kid. Group A, they are told that they are helicopter pilots. So in VR, they see the cockpit of a helicopter, right? Group B, they are told that they are Superman. So in VR, they actually fly like that. That's the only difference between the 2 experiences. The game is rigged, meaning that everyone, after 2 minutes, is going to find a kid and save the kid. Once again, you have a questionnaire with a researcher, and once again, all the questions are bullshit. The only thing that matters this time is that the researcher has a cup with 15 pens, and she inadvertently drops the pens on the floor. And then she waits 6 seconds to pick the first pen, and then she goes 1 pen per second. And what they measured is whether there was a difference between the helicopter pilots and the Superman. And so here are the results. 80% of the pilots help, 100% of the Superman. The pilots, on average, they waited 6 seconds, so they waited for the researcher to pick the first pen to help. The Superman, they only waited 3 seconds. So what you see here is a tiny difference in the design of the experience made a huge change in priming subconsciously altruistic behavior. And that's what makes VR very interesting. So when it comes to immersive learning, there are 3 value propositions, basically. The first one is learning in VR to do stuff with your hands. You're building psychomotor skills. The second one is about learning knowledge better. So imagine learning about, let's say, a heart. If you visualize a heart in 3D beating, it's a lot easier for you to form a mental image than if you have to see a succession of 2D images and somehow in your brain put them together and create an image. So cognitively speaking, it's a lot easier to learn in VR. But the one that really interests me is the behavior, is what happens when I put you in the body of someone else in VR and when you have to interact with people. Can we change behavior? Not just empathy, actually changing behavior. So we created something called the BODYSWAPS. And essentially, it's a soft skill simulators. So it's just like the flight simulator of my grandfather, but applied to soft skills. And it works by letting people embody workplace scenarios where they're going to interact with virtual humans. So for the sake of time, I'm gonna give you a quick example. We were approached by a company named Sage Publishing. So if you're at university, you might have books from them. So they are publishers in higher education, and they've basically been selling books for 150 years. They've been selling videos for 10, and they were wondering whether VR was the next big thing in education. And we answered that that's not a good question. A good question is whether there is a real challenge in education that you can solve with the technology. And so we decided to work with students who are going to become nurses in psychiatry. Because for those guys, they spend a year in a classroom learning all the theoretical knowledge, and then after a year, they start being placed in hospitals. And in hospitals, they're supposed to be supervised, but in reality, there's one supervisor for about 30 students, and the guy is already very busy with actual patients. So as a result, what you have is 20-something-year-old people roaming around psychiatric hospitals, completely inexperienced, completely terrified, having conversations with suicidal patients, psychotics, schizophrenics, and so on. And so that doesn't work for anyone, right? Because if you fuck up a conversation with someone who is suicidal, it can go very wrong. And so that's basically how it works, right? You enter VR, and you're going to meet your new body. So you see yourself, you say hello to yourself in the mirror, this is you. You build emotional presence. And then you meet the patient. So you get a little bit of a brief about Susan. She's 45, she's suicidal, and you're the nurse visiting her. And then you listen to her. So you can't hear her voice, but it's very emotional, very personal story. She's telling you about her husband and her dog and all things like that. And then you respond. And you can't hear it now, but when you respond with your own voice. You use the microphone. It's not like AAB, it's like real life. And so you really have to make an impression. You have to improvise. You have to help her. And then you swap bodies, hence the name. And so what it is here is seeing yourself back from the perspective of that person and understanding, okay, this is how I come across, this is how I sound, this is how I can progress and make everything better. And finally, you have analytics that are going to tell you what you did well and what you did wrong. So that's how we apply this idea of changing perspectives into VR. So what makes it unique is that Susan here her script was written by world-renowned subject matter experts. She was acted by a Shakespearean actress who's currently playing Henry IV in London. And the environment is whatever we want. So you go beyond role play. It becomes real play. You are yourself in that situation. Then obviously changing perspective is the best way to build self-awareness, to engage the emotional learning centers of the brain, and this way to really have behavioral change. And obviously, finally, you have analytics. So we did a small study because that's all beautiful, but if it's not working, it doesn't matter. And what we found is 90% of people said that getting that playback of themselves, hearing themselves, seeing themselves, really helped them understand how they could do better. And therefore, 93% of people said that they wanted to spend more time in the experience. And so, if you can give people the knowledge of how they're doing and create the desire to improve, you have something quite powerful. And so to finish, I wanted to share more on the design side of things than marketing, really, things that we have learned building immersive experiences. Is anyone in this room old enough to have played with a Tamagotchi? Okay, that's good. Has anyone in this room cried when the Tamagotchi died? Why am I talking about that? I'm talking about that because when you're in VR with a virtual human, you have to feel empathy for that person. And people often confuse the idea of empathy with realism. Realism does not matter. You had empathy for your Tamagotchi, and it didn't even have a face. All right? And that's what makes VR interesting, because you need to work on believability. You need to create a character that is consistent and coherent. And that comes from the voice, the facial expression, the reactivity. But it is not about realism. The next bit is about the Proteus Effect. So that's another experience where participants were asked to play the drums, and they either had plain white hands on the left, or black hands, or Caucasian hands. And what they measured is how much people moved their body in the experience. And so people who saw themselves as black moved their body more, right? So that's, an implicit, unconscious racist bias in a cool way, I guess. But that's the Proteus effect. So it's the idea that when you put someone in a virtual body, the body that you create for them is going to have an impact on their behavior. If you're taller in VR, you're going to be more confident. If you feel that you're hotter as a character in VR than you are in real life, you're going to keep speaking closer to people's faces even after the experience. If you have a body of another race, you're going to be less racist. And if you put in the body of a child, you're more scared of everything. The next bit is Ludonarrative Dissonance. Does anyone remember what that movie is? It's like the first movies of the 18 trilogies there's been about Spider-Man. And it was horrible. So that moment is when Peter Parker lost his uncle. So that's what we call in script writing the big bloom. So that's the saddest moment of the film. That's where you're supposed to feel sad. Now, let's imagine I give you that proposition. Okay, you're not just watching anymore. You can decide to say something nice to him, or ignore him, or slap him. So who would try to slap him? All right. So the minute you decide to slap him, you lose the empathy. It's fine to try to slap him, but the idea of ludonarrative dissonance is, depending on whether you want to create emotion or test people's decision, you have to make a choice. You cannot have interactivity and keep the empathy for people. The next point is about ontological design. What it means here is you wouldn't shout in a library. You wouldn't go naked to a church, apart from Earth probably. When you're in concert, you're close to each other, and etc. And what that means, ontological design, is every space that you live in comes with a set of social codes. They are implicit. You know them, you don't even think about them. And so in VR, when you're designing a space, you're actually designing the people's behavior within that space. And that's what it means. If you bring all of that together, you have what's called audience experience design. So I have 1 minute left, so I'll do that. In that experience, they created a fake VR. So everyone has goggles, and they either see the scene 90 degrees, 180, or 360. So they step in the room, and they have 3 minutes to watch what's happening. After they step out, they are told that this kid killed himself on that day. It's a recreation of that scene. And they ask people, why do you think he did it? The people in 90 degrees go very detective mode. They look at the score of the video game, the crumbles on the desk, and they think he killed himself out of shame. The people in 360 degrees, they go much more emotional. They say that the room was very silent, that there was no photos of friends. And they think that he killed himself out of loneliness. And obviously they were right. And so that is AX design, that's audience experience design. When you do immersive learning, you have to put yourself in the shoes of people emotionally, cognitively, and physically. And so I hope you understand now that it's not about the technology. Really, it's kind of irrelevant. What matters is whether we can change people's behavior. And we live in a world of bullying and discriminative behavior and fake news and all of that. And if every one of us, and as community, can change our behavior just a little bit with that technology, then there's a little bit of hope. So I hope you guys are hopeful, and enjoy Jeff, and thank you.